Hello, my name is Lucy Bowen, play therapist with the National Association for Play Therapy India, and I would like to welcome you to our Play Therapy as a Counselling Tool program. And this is our first part of the program, the first video, and today we are going to be looking at the theory and principles of play therapy. So this session is going to be much more theoretical than the upcoming sessions. In the future sessions, we are going to have discuss a lot more of the practical implications and have a lot of reflective tasks and activities for you to do. But as I said, in order for us to understand what is play therapy and how to utilize it effectively, it is of course important for us to first understand the theory and the principles that underpin it. So, I'd like us to start just by having a bit of a think. What is play? Because of course we are working with play therapy, so it's important of course that we can also understand the value of play. So if I ask you what is play, very often the first thing that comes to somebody's mind is that it's something that's fun, it's a leisure activity, and very often play is misconceived as being sort of frivolous and meaningless fun, something that should be separate or something that should be performed after the child sort of finishes their work. But what we have to understand is that play is so much more valuable than that. Play is essential for the child's learning and development. And when a child plays, they actually engage holistically. We're simultaneously working on physical, cognitive, imaginative, creative, emotional, and social elements through play. So it's really important to understand that play is actually the work of the child, and more importantly, it's also the natural language of the child, which helps the child to actually express themselves and to communicate their thoughts and feelings to us through play. So even dating back to Plato himself said, you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. So that's something really, really important to think about. So as I just mentioned briefly, there's a lot of developmental benefits for play, but of course there are a lot of therapeutic benefits to play as well. And these are what we try to utilize through play therapy and therapeutic play work. So what then might be the therapeutic benefits of play? Well, first and foremost, play is fun. And when we have fun, we're able to be engaged, we feel relaxed, it's a stress relief. So just by playing itself can be very, very therapeutic. Furthermore, when we play, we have that freedom to express ourselves and to actually explore the self and explore the environment and explore the things that are happening around us. And when we play, it's non-judgmental, so there's no right or wrong way to play. Play can also be very cathartic. It can, like I said, provide us with that release. It can be very, very stress relieving. It can also allow us to purge ourselves of negative thoughts and feelings. We can try out real life situations. It can help to develop our creative problem solving skills. And what's most important, it allows us to express what we cannot put into words. So play therapy, it incorporates art, music, drama, and play. So we're giving the child a lot of different mediums and modes of expression. And through these various mediums, we actually enable the child to access their inner world and to express us. So the use of play materials and metaphors, it can provide the child with that safe distance from that traumatic material, and it can provide us with an access to the child's unconscious. As Froebel noted then, play is the highest development in childhood, for it alone is the free expression of what is in the child's soul. So the child's play is not mere sport, but it's full of meaning and import. So the most important thing to note here is we have to have an understanding everything a child says, everything that the child does is an expression of what's within, and everything has an underlying meaning. So if a child is hitting another child, or if a child is persistently telling lies, we're not only going to focus on that negative behavior. Rather, we have to understand maybe the child is always telling lies because they have low self-esteem or low confidence. So our role in play therapy is that we don't focus on the problem. We try to focus on the child and helping them to resolve that underlying issue. Because if we focus only on modifying the behavior, and we don't address that underlying issue, then it's likely that that issue is going to manifest itself in another manner further down the line. So what's also important to note when we're looking at play and we're looking at play therapy is that play is not the same for everyone. So what you or me interpret as play may not be interpreted as such by the child. And what we're going to look at through this course is that we're going to be following a child-centered approach. So it's not based on our opinions of play. It's not our role to teach or to judge or to interpret, but rather to allow the child to project and to process. So if the child picks up this cow and the child tells you that this is a monster, then for the purpose of play, this has to be the monster. Or, for example, if the child just wants to come into the session and they just want to squeeze in the sensory ball because that's very relaxing and very, very therapeutic for us, it's not our position to try and say, no, why don't you play with the cow? Why don't you play with the lion? Or let's do some role play and wear the mask. Throughout play therapy, we are following the child's lead. We have a trust in the child that they're going to take the session where they need it to be at that moment in time. So what's really important to note here is that we don't direct the play and we don't try to take the child back to the play of previous sessions either. So if maybe in one session your child came and they were engaging in role play with you and they were clearly depicting a traumatic event, but in the next session the child just comes into the session and they just want to bang the drum or do something which you might interpret as kind of meaningless, we remember that it's not meaningless for the child. So it may be that maybe the child disclosed something traumatic in the previous session and they have the feeling to withdraw from you in the next session as they have to rebuild their confidence. Or it might be that the child had a really bad day and they came in, they just want to release their anger by banging the drum really loud. We never know exactly what's going on in the child's life. And also what's important to note is that the child doesn't always have to tell us. We're going to be talking a little later about the ideas of working in a conscious and an unconscious level. And as I said, it's not our role to dig out from the child and make them tell their deepest and darkest secrets and problems. Rather, our job is to facilitate the growth and the emotional well-being of the child. So if the child comes in and they get a release by banging the drum or by throwing the ball or by tearing up some paper, then we are providing them with that safe space in which they can express. And for some children, it's not that they necessarily need to tell us or show us their problems. Sometimes they just need a safe space where they can actually regain that feeling of control over their otherwise very, very stressful lives. So, as I said, the main thing is that we're always going to respect the child to take the session where they need it to be. We're going to respect the how and what the child wants to play with, and we're always trying to follow the child's lead. And as I said, not to judge, not to interpret, but what we do is we reflect back on our experience with the child. And we're going to be talking about this in a lot more detail in the next session on child empowerment. So, on slide 8, you will see a diagram of the therapeutic play continuum, which shows play, play work, therapeutic play, and play therapy, and the idea how the different types of play, whether it be play, therapeutic play, play therapy, can help children with from slight to more severe issues. So, for example, a child who might just be frustrated and angry, we might just see positive changes by actually just allowing the child the freedom to play. As I said, play in itself is very therapeutic by nature. Children with more complex issues, such as those who might have experienced some kind of trauma or abuse, which we'll be discussing in the later sessions, then can obviously benefit by receiving play therapy. So just to break that down a little bit, we're going to just clarify the definitions of what is play, play work, therapeutic play, and play therapy. So play, by its simplest definition, is a physical or mental leisure activity that is undertaken purely for enjoyment or amusement and has no other objective. And this is a simple dictionary definition of play, and obviously this refers to the idea of free play. But obviously, even though it notes here that it has no other objective, play itself is never meaningless. The child is always learning, the child is always engaged, and there's of course a huge number of therapeutic benefits as we've started to discuss. So play work then. Play work is something that is very, very commonly used by teachers, by some therapists, and it's the idea that we use toys and materials to engage the child, but the objectives of the play work are not therapeutic, although obviously because we're playing there may be some therapeutic benefits as a secondary effect, but this is obviously dependent on the child's interpretation. Just because you bring toys to the session, it doesn't mean that the child's going to interpret it as play or that they're going to find it fun, because play is something different for everyone. For example, if I pick up a water bottle, we don't interpret this as play. But if I start to splash you with the water, then it might be fun. Or if I start to tap, 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 tap and make some music, then that might also become play for me. So play is not dependent necessarily upon the toys and the materials, but it's dependent on the interpretation and the interactions. So as I said, just because you think something's fun, just because you something is play, it might not always be interpreted as such by the child. So the other main differences between play work and therapeutic play or play therapy is that very often games are played and rules are applied. But when we're engaging in therapeutic play, we try to reduce the rules and minimize the rules. So in play work, there's always the role of a teacher as a sort of a hierarchical figure, whereas in play therapy, as we're going to discuss the therapist's role, is more built on that idea of equality. So play work is very often used to assist an educational process and has specific goals and a specific agenda. Whereas therapeutic play and play therapy, the main objective is actually to improve the emotional well-being of the child. So therapeutic play and play therapy, we're following the same principles. Of course, the only difference is, if we're carrying out therapeutic play, then we might be dealing with children with less severe issues, and with play therapy, maybe with more severe issues. The idea is that therapeutic play and play therapy, we follow the same principles, but it's only really dependent on our experience. So, for example, if you don't have any experience in counselling or in play therapy after taking this course, before taking this course, doesn't mean that just from taking the simple course you're going to be equipped to go and deal with children maybe that have experienced some kind of sexual abuse if you haven't had any prior experience. However, you might be equipped to start taking therapeutic play sessions with children who may have less severe issues. As I've mentioned in the introductory email, and the purpose of sending you the knowledge and skills questionnaire before starting the course is that it's of course very, very important to be able to be self-reflective and to be able to understand our own limitations, because we are of course dealing with a child's mental health. So it's important that we make sure that we are proficient and have enough knowledge and understanding when taking on any case. And throughout as we proceed through this course, we're going to be doing a lot more sort of self-reflective activities as well, to sort of work on our own self-awareness and our own skills as a therapist. Okay, so going by the official definition of play therapy, according to the British Association for Play Therapists, so they describe play therapy as the dynamic process between the child and the therapist, in which the child explores at his or her own pace and with his or her own agenda those issues past and current, conscious and unconscious, that are affecting the child's life in the present. So the important things to take from this first and foremost is that the child explores at his or her own pace. That means that the child is leading. As I said, we have the trust in the child to take the therapy session where they need it to be in that moment in time. Our role as a therapist is not to push the child or to push them beyond their point of readiness. So again, we say issues that might be conscious or unconscious. Sometimes the child might clearly know what's bothering them. Other times the child might not always be aware of the underlying issues that are causing that distress. So again, through the medium of play, it allows these reasons sometimes to come to the surface. And sometimes it also allows for an unconscious resolution to happen as well. And again, we're going to be talking about this more in detail. As I said, today is a little bit theoretical. I hope it's not too boring and too complicated. But I will be providing you with some additional reading materials as well. And as we proceed through the course, we will be talking about how these principles are applied in the practical. So, as we said, the main also thing to take away from this as well is that it's things that are affecting the child's life in the present. So our role is not always to go back to and bring the child back to a traumatic point or to their past behaviors, but we're focusing on the child right now in the moment. So we're focusing on the child, not on the problem, not on the issues. We're focusing on the child as they are in our session. So We're going to talk then a bit about the underlying theoretical framework of play therapy before we go on to talk about the key sort of principles. So there's a wide range of theoretical models that are used by play therapists. These can include psychoanalytical, release, structured, relational, behavioral, gestalt, Jungian, filial, theraplay, developmental, etc. And this framework often guides the way in which the therapist organizes their thinking. So I'm not going to go into detail in all these different types of play therapy. You're of course welcome to read up more on yourself, and I'm happy to provide you with any additional reading materials. And what's important to note is that many of these approaches mentioned are a little more directive, and we will mostly be discussing non-directive play therapy throughout this course. Excuse me. However, we will be talking about some directive tasks, and I will be giving examples, and you will also be engaging in some activities yourselves, as sometimes these are required to assist the therapeutic process, and we often dip into multiple theoretical models depending on the need of the child. For example, we might use theraplay if the child has a poor attachment, or filial therapy to assist with the parent-child relationship. So talking about the history and the theories of play therapy. So play therapy has its grounding in psychoanalysis. And some key sort of theorists just to note on this is Jung. Jung valued the therapeutic importance of individuality. So consequently, the therapist becomes a fellow participant in the therapeutic process. So as I discussed briefly, and I'm going to talk more about, we as the play therapist are not in a hierarchical position. We are rather a facilitator and a co-partner in the child's therapeutic journey. So another key theorist is Melanie Klein. She noted that play is sort of similar to free association in adult therapy, in that it can provide us with the child with access to the unconscious. So as I said, the child might project something through play or through art or through drama that might be a mirror of the child's inner world. And Anna Freud then, she noted that play, through the medium of play, this also helps the therapist to form a secure attachment with the child. And forming that attachment, building that relationship with the child, helps us and provides us with access into their inner life. So the key things to note here, as we said, is building that relationship with the child and providing the child with multiple mediums in which they can express their inner world and their inner self. So how play therapy then relates to psychoanalysis is that, it provides the avenue for decontextualization. So that is when we put something into play or art, when we actually draw something or we act something out, then it becomes external. What's within ourselves comes outside. And when it's outside, when it's on paper or when it's through play, then it can become much, much easier for us to analyze and to actually understand. And as I said, we're going to be doing a lot of activities in the upcoming sessions, so you'll get the sort of hands-on experience of this. We often very find that when you start with a picture or a story, you might think it's very meaningless or fictional, but when we actually start to take a closer look, we can understand that actually it has a deeper meaning and some relation to something that is going on in our lives. So play also, as I previously mentioned, has that cathartic effect. So it can allow children to purge themselves of negative feelings which can be associated with traumatic events, and it also rids the child of the constraints and sanctions of reality. So that is, it actually provides the child with a safe zone of expression. So, it enables us to express through play what actually might be frowned upon in real life. For example, aggression. The child might want to shoot in the play therapy room, or they might want to beat the puppet, and it's our job as the play therapist to actually allow the child to have that safe space to express both those positives and those negative emotions without judgment. Obviously, it's very important that we make sure the child remains safe when doing this, and we're going to be talking about this again when we talk about limit setting as we progress through the series. But it's very important, as I said, we're not judging, we're allowing that child that safe space where they can express both their positive and negative feelings, because it's not wrong for the child to feel sad, or it's not wrong for the child to feel angry. Only sometimes the behaviors that they exhibit as a result of this might be negative or might be undesirable. So our role as a play therapist is to provide that safe zone where the child can express and explore those feelings in a very safe manner. And play can also then provide an opportunity to enhance the child's understanding by maybe changing roles as the victim or being the punisher, or by transferring negative feelings to a substitute object. So that is, the child can project their thoughts and feelings. So both projection and transference can occur through play. So on the next slide, number 17, you'll see a diagram of the play therapy dimensions model. And this notes both the therapist and the child's role within a play therapy session. So if we start first on the horizontal line, we'll see non-directive and directive. So this is detail in the therapist's role. So non-directive, as I said, we're going to mostly focus on, that would be low immersion. So the therapist is following the child's direction. If we move more to directive, that would be more high immersion, where the therapist is more active and directive. And what we find is that we mostly try to remain non-directive, but obviously if the child requires further assistance or the child gets stuck, then we might sometimes move a little more to the directive side. But what's important is that we note that we are only doing that for the benefit of the child and to meet the needs of the child. We're never trying to be directive to try and hurry that therapy session along. Okay, so on the vertical line, then we'll see the conscious and the unconscious. As I said, sometimes it might be that a child might be very, very much working on a conscious level. They might be coming in and, the child might, be hitting the cow with the lion because they might be trying to portray their anger towards somebody or to release that anger. Or sometimes the child might directly come in and tell you on a conscious level, I really hate my teacher. My teacher shouted at me today for no reason. So obviously if the child is working on a conscious level, then we might want to help the child to try and decontextualize to better understand that problem. We might ask the child, would you like to do some role play, or would you like to act it out with the characters? Would you like to show me what happened, or would you like to show me what you would have liked to have happened? So that through using the toys and the materials, we can help the child to better express and possibly resolve their issues. For some children, they might be working on a very, very unconscious level. For example, maybe the child comes in and they just start hugging the puppet. You can see that the child is obviously very, very sad, very, very distraught. But remember, the purpose of using play and play therapy is to decontextualize, to provide that child with a safe distance from the traumatic materials so they feel more free to express. If I just say, why are you feeling sad? Then the child, might be very, very reluctant to open up. But if I observe what the child is doing, I can see that you're holding the puppet very, very tightly. I wonder how the puppet might be feeling. Then the child might open up, and say, but it's feeling very sad. I might say, I wonder what might have happened to make the puppet feel sad. And the child might sometimes slip from the unconscious to the conscious. They might say, my teacher shouted at me. But what's important in that case is that we don't then move it to the child, because the child may or may not know that they have said, directed it to themselves. So we might say, oh, so I understand the teacher shouted at the puppet. We try to keep it in terms of the play, because when it's that safe distance, it's much easier for the child to express. For example, if we know that the lion attacking the cow is the child's father maybe attacking the mother that the child has witnessed, the child is much more able to express when we say, I wonder how the cow is feeling when the lion is attacking it. Rather than I say, how does your mother feel when your father attacks her? It's much, much more directive, and the child is much less likely to sort of open up and feel comfortable to talk about it. Okay, so as I said, in terms of the therapist, then we can work as directive or non-directive, and from the child's perspective, sometimes the child is working at an unconscious and sometimes at a conscious level, and obviously, it's not strictly conscious or unconscious, directive or non-directive. It's very, very fluid, and you'll find both the therapist and the child move along the spectrum. So directive play therapy then, as we've touched on, is exactly what it says. It is directive. which means that the therapist leads or guides the sessions. So very often creative activities are used to in order to sort of gauge the thoughts, feelings and behaviors of the child. So it's much more goal orientated if we know the child has a specific issue. And it does have the advantage that it allows for specific evidence of change and growth in the child, which is a little bit more complicated when we are working in a non-directive manner. But as I said, directive activities can be useful, and we are going to be looking at some directive activities when we look at trauma and abuse and addressing certain issues with the child. So because they can be often useful when the child might be stuck and they might not be able to progress by themselves or naturally through non-directive play. They can also be useful maybe in school settings sometimes when you have only very limited time or limited sessions with the child. But as I said, we can introduce these directive activities to the child, but it's important that we're not forcing or imposing on or trying to push, as I said, the child beyond their readiness. So we're going to move on then to look at non-directive play therapy. As I said, we're going to be mostly focusing and working on the principles of non-directive play therapy throughout this course. So non-directive play therapy then comes from the Rogerian model of person-centered counselling. It's also referred to as child-centered play therapy. So it is exactly what it says in the name. It is non-directive and it is child-centered. So that means we are following the child's lead, and as a therapist we are trying not to take the direction of the session. So our role rather is to reflect the feelings, restate content and return responsibility to the child. That means that we are not trying to force the child to change, we're not trying to teach the child, rather we're trying to empower the child to make the choices and make the changes. So we have the belief that children are actually able to work out their own problems when appropriately facilitated through the use of unconditional positive regard. That is a very key term in play therapy. Unconditional positive regard. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with the child's behaviors or with the actions, but we don't judge the child. Rather, we understand that there is a deeper meaning and we try to help the child to resolve that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about person-centered therapy, from which non-directive play therapy comes. So as I said, it's developed from Carl Rogers, and it's a humanistic theory with the belief that each of us has a natural potential that we can actualize and through which we can find meaning. So it has a focus on the respect and trust for the client. And according to person-centered therapy, there are necessary and sufficient conditions which must take place in order for change to occur and for the therapy to be successful. And I'm just going to go through these briefly because it's also something that's quite important to note when we are working with children in a play therapy context. So the first thing is psychological contact. That is the idea that a relationship must exist so that two people can have an impact on each other. So in person-centered counselling and in play therapy, the therapeutic relationship is essentially key. As I said, and I keep saying, we're not in a position of hierarchy. Rather, the relationship is built on respect and positive regard. Obviously, it's important to note that boundaries must still be kept, and we are going to discuss this, how you keep your boundaries and how you set limits as we progress through the course. So the second point then is incongruence in the client. So that's the idea that for a change to take place, the client must be in a state of psychological vulnerability, and there's often a discrepancy between the individual's view of themselves and their actual experience. For example, in depression or anxiety, we have that negative view of ourselves, which other people might not actually have. So although the individual might not necessarily be aware of this incongruence or vulnerability, they will be as the therapy continues. So that's the idea, as the child or as the person progresses through therapy, they actually increase their self-awareness as well. So the third point is congruence and genuineness. So as I said, it's very important that we're able to be self-reflective, to understand our strengths and our own limitations. So as a therapist, we also need to be very aware of themselves. We need to be aware of our feelings and our experiences as we relate to the client. For example, if maybe a topic of abuse comes up, we need to know whether that's going to impact on us. Because when we're working with the child in a non-judgmental way, we're trying to build it on equality and mutual respect. The slightest facial change or sign of negativity or sign of us struggling or being hurt can directly impact and be transferred to the child. So it's really, really important that we're also open to understanding our own experiences as well as those of the child or the client. So the fourth point, as we talked about, is that unconditional positive regard. So the therapist does not judge the client, but accepts the client as who he or she is. As I said, this doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with them, but we have to accept and have an understanding that there's a reason. So we should not be judging that behavior. So the fifth point is empathy. So it's really, really important as a therapist that we are empathetic, and we have to enter the world of the child or the client, leaving behind as much as possible our own values. Of course, it's not always possible to be completely value-free, but we have to monitor our own feelings, our own values, and we try as much as possible to understand the experience of the client and what it is to be that client. So caring and warmth are expressed often in statements of empathy. Now, for example, if the child might be throwing something and it's about to break, we're not just going to tell the child, no, don't do that, it's going to break. Because obviously that's going to give a lot of negativity to the child, and that's putting us more in a position of hierarchy. That's not showing mutual respect to the child. Rather, if the child was throwing something it was going to break, I might reflect to the child, I understand that you're feeling angry. You know, I also feel angry sometimes and feel like throwing things. But if we throw this toy, it's going to break and then we won't be able to play with it anymore. But I understand that you're feeling angry. Maybe we can find something else that might be safe to throw, or another way that you might like to express your anger. So we're being empathetic. We're not judging the child for throwing the toy even though it might break. We're showing that respect to the child, that we know that they're angry, and trying to work with the child to find a way in which they can express it safely. And again, we're going to be talking about this a lot more, about how to set limits and about the words and the language that we use, because that's something that's very, very important when working with a child in play therapy. So the sixth point then is that perception of empathy and acceptance. So it's not only that we must be unconditionally accepting and understanding the child or the client, but the child should also perceive that he is being understood and accepted. So of course, our tone of voice, our physical expressions, these things all contribute to the communication of empathy and acceptance. So, you know, like I said, the slightest negative facial expression or a tone of being bored or disinterested can very, very quickly break down that therapeutic relationship. So it's the same as even, you know, checking your watch or getting lost in your own thoughts. It's very, very important in play therapy that we are with the child every single moment of the session and reflecting back their feelings and their behaviors and showing that 100% focus on the child. Not being preoccupied by what the parents have said, not being preoccupied with any problem we know they're facing. We need to be with the child there in the moment, in the present. So the client's experience then in person-centered therapy, even in play therapy, is first that they should experience responsibility. So as I said, all the time we're trying to return that responsibility back to the child. So if the child picks up this and says, "What is this?" or "What should I do with this?" then I might say, you know, "What would you like to do with it?" I'm not going to direct or tell the child what to do, rather I'm trying to empower the child to make that decision themselves. So the child should actually start to experience responsibility. They should experience the therapist, and as we said, they should experience the therapist as being genuine, as being interested, as being empathetic and non-judgmental. And through that experience of responsibility, they start to take control through the therapeutic relationship. Then comes the process of exploration. And through exploration, the child or the person, they start to experience and understand themselves. And that's when they can begin to start to experience and make change. So the goals then of person-centered therapy is to increase the independence and the integration of the client. As we said, we want to focus on the person, we're not focusing on the problem. And we want to create the conditions necessary for positive growth. So essentially, we want to develop an openness to new experience, for the child or client to trust in themselves, as in have their own internal source of evaluation, and have that willingness to actually to continue growing and to implement those changes. So important things to remember is that the relationship is everything. And as I said, that relationship is characterized by equality. What's also important to note is that there are no specific stages to the process. It's about the child's or the client's own process of change and growth, and this has to happen at their own pace. As I said, all the time we're striving to be better and to make that change, and in one session we might see a vast improvement and improved emotional regulation, for example. In the next session the child might come in and they might be very, very upset or very, very angry, because obviously all the time we are striving for that optimal growth, optimal achievement, but every day in life we do face new obstacles and new challenges. So as we move forward, we also move backwards. You know, we can't always just continue moving forward and making progress. So we have to understand, as I said, respect the client to take the session where they need it to be in that moment in time, and understand that they have to progress at their own pace. Now, for example, if you are feeling sad, and your friends come over and they say, come, we're going to the movies, and you're in the movies and you're still feeling sad, and they ask you, why are you feeling sad? We're watching a movie, you're with friends, you should be happy. You can't just suddenly be happy, because you yourself have to process that feeling of sadness and overcome it before you can be happy. No one can just tell you to be happy. You can't just switch off and change your feelings. And for everyone, it happens at a different pace. For some people, when someone in the family dies, the next day someone might go to work and act perfectly normal. For somebody else, they might be crying for several weeks. Everyone processes their emotions and their feelings and their experiences at a different pace. And as the therapist, we have to respect that. We're not judging the child based on age, based on gender, or anything like that. We're just taking each child as the individual that they are and focusing on the child as the person, not focusing on the problem. Excuse me. Okay, so moving on then to non-directive play therapy, the child-centered approach. So as I said, it's based on this client-centered work as Carl Rogers, as we've just discussed, and is adapted essentially to apply for children, and it's primarily developed by Virginia Axline. And it follows the same premise that we all have it within ourselves, the ability to solve our own problems. So the role of the child-centered therapist is to facilitate the child's growth. As I said, it's not to direct, not to force, not to teach. We don't try to lead or take responsibility for the direction of play. We're following the child's lead, and we're understanding that the play is the child's primary mode of communication. So Axline then developed 8 principles which we try to follow as a play therapist. So the first then is that we must develop a warm, friendly relationship with the child in which a good rapport is established as soon as possible. So as I said, we do this by having positive regard. I keep mentioning this buzzword is positive regard, by having respect, by being non-judgmental, by following the child's lead and showing up the total respect for the child. So the therapist then accepts the child exactly as they are. And the therapist establishes a feeling of permissiveness in a relationship so that the child feels free to express their feelings completely. So as I said, by being non-judgmental, by being non-directive, we're providing that child with that feeling of security where they can actually express and explore themselves. So the therapist then should be alert to recognizing the feelings of the child is expressing and reflect those feelings back to them in such a manner that the child gains insight into their behavior. So the example I gave, if the child is throwing down the toys, in that moment in time, the child might not realize why they are throwing the toys. But if we can see and understand that the child is feeling angry, and we can reflect that back to the child and empathize that it's okay to feel angry, then the child can actually start to better understand their feelings. And obviously then, as you can understand our feelings, we're better able to regulate them. So the therapist then should maintain a deep respect for the child's ability to solve their problems if given an opportunity to do so. So the responsibility to make choices and to institute change is the child's. As we said, we can't just force the child to change, to feel something differently. We have to work and facilitate the child. We might provide options and alternatives for the child, but the child has to take responsibility for those changes, as the child can never really be responsible for their actions if they haven't made that choice themselves. So the therapist does not attempt to direct the child's actions or conversation, so the child should lead the way and the therapist will follow. And again, in the next session on child empowerment, we're going to be talking a lot about the ideas of tracking, about our reflective listening and our language, and how we actually work to follow the child's lead and to empower the child through play. So the 7th point then, as you mentioned, the therapist doesn't attempt to hurry the therapy along. It is a gradual process, and we have to recognize that as a therapist. And the final point, the 8th point, is that the therapist establishes only those limitations that are necessary to anchor the therapy to the world of reality and to make the child aware of her responsibility in the relationship. So wherever possible, we try to limit rules, because when we say no, when we say don't, these sort of words have a negative impact on the child's self-esteem. So usually we have 3 rules, and that the child should, that the child, us, and our materials should remain safe. So the child shouldn't hurt himself or herself, the child shouldn't hurt us, and the child shouldn't hurt the materials. And again, in the empowerment session, we're going to be talking very much about the language that we use, because that's very, very important. So again, with the example of throwing a cow, I'm not going to say, don't do that, why are you doing that, don't break that, because that's going to make the child feel very, very bad. But if we can actually empathize the feeling, but also reflect and help the child to gain an insight into that behavior. Obviously, if after we reflect, the child continues to throw the toy and break the toy, we might again say, I understand you're feeling angry, but if we continue to throw the toy, it might break. So if we throw it again, I'm going to have to take the toy away. So we're making that differentiation between the child being wrong and the action being wrong. The child shouldn't feel like their anger is wrong, but the child obviously has to know that there is a consequence for that action. So holding the child with positive regard and building that relationship on respect and equality, it doesn't mean that we let the child do whatever we want, because obviously it's very, very important that the child does understand consequences, and the child also does need to build their self-esteem for having a true reflection of themselves. And obviously the child needs to be able to learn to regulate their emotions and to control these behaviors as well. And our role is to facilitate the child in gaining an insight into these thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, so that we can help and empower them to make those changes. And again, as I said today, very much theoretical, but we will obviously be given more examples as to how this actually works in practice as we progress through the series. So I'm just going to touch on 2 more theories, that is attachment theory and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So attachment theory is the idea that children need a secure base, and that is that they're able to trust their primary caregiver. And a secure attachment leads to subsequent healthy development, whereas an insecure attachment leads to an unhealthy development. And our attachment styles affect our relationships as we go through life. So if we have poor experience of attachment with our mother, then that could consequently lead to us having a very, very low self-esteem and less confidence to actually enter into relationships with others later on in life. So our attachment styles affect those relationships as we go through life. So if the caregiver's responses to the child's needs are appropriate, then the child would usually feel confident to explore a strange environment, occasionally returning to the caregiver for confirmation. So it provides the child with that confidence to actually go out and explore. Whereas if the caregiver's response to the child are inappropriate, the child becomes insecure and less likely to use the caregiver as a base for exploring the strange environment. So I said it could result in the child having very, very low confidence or low self-esteem, or it could go in the opposite direction where the child is fearless because they feel no boundaries or no limitations. So trust and security is central to attachment theory, and without a secure base to make the child feel secure and confident, it can become difficult for them to take emotional risks and form relationships with others. So children can also adopt negative views of themselves and others based on their experience of poor early attachment. So if the parent is always saying, no, you're so stupid, don't do this, why are you doing that, what's wrong with you, why can't you be more like your brother, why are you doing like this, look, all your friends are so much better than you, then the child is going to develop that very, very negative self-image, and it's very likely that they will feel very, very insecure about themselves. So abused and neglected children can especially find it difficult in developing secure attachment relationships, and children with special needs may also develop attachment relationships in different ways. So how then does this relate to play therapy? Well, as I said, in the role of the play therapist and the purpose of the play therapy room is to create a safe zone of expression for the child. It is to build a relationship built on trust, to provide that security for the child to actually start to explore themselves and understand the world. So the play therapist can provide the child with a secure base with which he can explore his emotions, his thoughts, and his beliefs. So the therapist who provides a secure base for the child can work similarly to a mother who provides the child with a secure base from which to explore the world. So the therapist can provide the security that the child may not be receiving elsewhere. So in the play therapy room, it allows for the freedom and comfort for the child to explore themselves, the world around, and any issues that they might be facing. And again, that's at their own pace where they're held with complete positive regard. Obviously, as I said, it's important to maintain our boundaries. We're not trying to play the role of a mother. We're not trying to play the role of a friend. But equally, we're not a teacher. We're not in a hierarchical position. Rather, we're being non-judgmental. We're being very, very neutral. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about this when we look at the language that we use with the child in the next session. So the idea then is that we're providing that child with that safe zone of expression. We're providing that safe space in which they can try and test feelings and behaviors and test real life situations, essentially. And obviously, as the child develops that confidence within the play therapy room, as they build the trust, the security, they start to interact with the therapist, then, these new skills and this added confidence transcends outside into the real world as well. So we're just going to talk briefly about Maslow's hierarchy of needs if we look on slide 32. So I'm only going to go in very, very briefly, but essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs details that we are all on a path towards self-actualization. We're all trying to realize our full potential. But obviously there's a lot of things that come below that, and very, very often as we start, as I said, to progress up the pyramid, something happens in our lives that brings us back down to a level. So we can never really reach that point of self-actualization. But all that time we are trying and going through the various stages. So if we look at the pyramid, we have at the bottom our physiological needs. Then we have safety needs, love and belonging needs, esteem needs, to reach that point of self-actualization. And the idea is all of these things need to be fulfilled in order for us to reach our full potential. And it doesn't necessarily work on a stage by stage. And through play therapy, we can actually help children to actualize and realize a lot of those needs that are detailed in the pyramid. But obviously the first thing to note is that the one thing that we cannot do as a therapist is meet the child's physiological needs. So if the child doesn't have a home, if the child is starving, if the child doesn't have food, water, shelter, then it's going to be very, very difficult for us to really help the child to progress, because the child's always going to be thinking, I'm hungry, or I'm cold, or I'm tired. So it's important that we first try to make sure that the child's physiological needs are being met before we start taking a client for the therapy session. But in terms of the other things noted on the period, we can actually start to help the child progress in all those other areas. For example, in terms of safety, as we said, we're actually providing that child with a secure base where they can start to build their confidence and feel safe to try new things, to start to actually interact. In terms of love and belonging needs, as I said, we're not showing love of a mother, but we are showing that unconditional positive regard. We are being non-judgmental, so it allows the child again to start to trust in relationships, which means that they can actually start to build relationships with others outside of the therapy room as well. Again, of course, in play therapy, we're also trying to help the child to boost their self-esteem. We're not telling them everything they do is right, but we're helping the child to gain a realistic image of themselves and to actually trust in themselves and essentially to regain a sense of control over their own lives, which helps to boost their confidence. So we're all the time through play therapy trying to facilitate the child to reach that optimal growth and progress, essentially, to reach their full potential. So play therapy then can help with children with a wider range of issues. It can help with bereavement, it can help with parental separation, it can help with children who have witnessed or experienced abuse or bullying, children who have nightmares, children who might be having illness, Children, as I said, who experience any kind of trauma or abuse, children who have low self-esteem, behavioral issues, learning difficulties, sensory processing issues, children with difficulties with emotional regulation, low mood, anxiety or phobias, school refusers, communication, interaction or social difficulties, as well as developmental delays as well that can include autism, Down syndrome, ADHD, global developmental delay. Play therapy can help children with these wider range of issues. And as I said, today we're just talking about the theoretical and the underlying principles of play therapy, but we are going to go on throughout the series to understand how does play therapy actually help these types of children. But the main benefits then of play therapy is that it provides children with that increased self-confidence, improved decision making, that feeling of control over the environment, which is something that's very, very important. For example, a child with ADHD who is very, very hyperactive in the classroom, all the time is being told, no, don't do this, no, sit down, do your work, don't do that, no, sit down, keep still. So the child might feel very, very helpless. So sometimes actually just going into the play therapy setting where they're allowed to be free, where the therapist is showing them respect and following their lead, that can really be very, very therapeutic for them, and that can help them to better regulate themselves in their more stressful or structured parts of the day. Play therapy can also enable better adaptive play. It can help a resolution of emotional barriers, reduce feelings of anxiety, depression and anger, develop cognitive functioning. It can also help with our creative problem solving, abstract thinking, and in general provides the child with increased autonomy, increased relaxation, increased learning and motivation to learn, improved self-expression, decreased feelings of separateness, and increased adaptability and flexibility. So there are a huge, vast array of benefits of engaging the child in play therapy. And, most importantly, we're following the child's lead. So that's very, very therapeutic for the child in itself, giving them that feeling of control. And we're also not expecting the child to talk and to tell us their thoughts and feelings, because we're using various modes of play to provide that child with that freedom of expression in a very, very safe zone. So what is our role then as a therapist? Our role is to create a welcoming environment where the child is held with positive regard, to restate what the child says, if anything, to reflect back feeling and content. And again, in the next session, we're going to be talking about this in a lot more detail. We set limits in the playroom that prohibit the child from hurting themselves, us, or the materials, and we have the emphasis on the natural way that a child can work out an issue. We also, of course, need to participate in the activities and play, but we have to do that with the permission of the child. We're being non-directive, we're following the child's lead. So if the child is playing with the animals, we might ask, this looks really interesting, could I join you? Which animal would you like me to be? What would my animal do? We shouldn't in any way try to direct or add our own story, because we don't know what the child might be projecting through their play. So it's really, really important that all the time we're taking the lead and the direction and the permission, returning that responsibility back to the child. So we should be creating that safe environment where the child can get in touch with who they are, what they're thinking, feeling, wishing, dreaming. We're not judging, we're not interpreting, but rather we're reflecting on what we see and experience with the child. We're having that belief in the child's own ability to find a balance in their life. And sometimes we might make suggestions, but as I said, we have to be aware that the responsibility for accepting and applying these suggestions and the change, it rests on the child. So all the time we should be giving the child choices, because the child, as I said, cannot accept full responsibility for something that they did not choose themselves. So our main objectives then, to summarize, in child-centered play therapy is we want to help the child to develop a more positive self-concept, want them to assume greater self-responsibility, to become more self-directing, more self-accepting, more self-reliant. We want to help them to engage in self-determined decision-making, to experience that feeling of control over the self and over their world, to become sensitive to the process of coping, to develop an internal source of evaluation, and essentially to become more trusting of self, to build their confidence and to build their self-esteem. So as I said, I hope this session has not been too complicated, as it's a little theoretical. We're just touching on the underlying theory and the principles of play therapy. And as we progress now through the next videos, we're going to start to understand how these theories, these principles can actually be utilized to help children with various issues. And I will be sending you some additional resource materials to go along with this session, and you are most welcome to contact me at any time with any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for listening.